So we're live on YouTube now, so we'll get started. So hello everyone and welcome to tonight's event to mark the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we are gathered upon today. I know that many of our viewers are tuning in from all across Canada, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands too. The International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia takes place every year on the 17th of May and is a global opportunity to draw attention to the violence and discrimination experienced by LGBTQI people across the world. You would hope that in 2021 there wouldn't be a need for Idahotb, but unfortunately not every country is as welcoming to the LGBT community as Ireland is or as Canada is, and so mark it we must. So for example, on the Trans Day of Remembrance, which is acknowledged every year, last year, we found that 350 trans people had been murdered in 2020, which was up from 331 in 2019. By April of this year alone, 13 trans women had been murdered just in the United States. So you can imagine how high that number is around the world. 71 countries still criminalize consensual same-sex activity between men. 43 countries criminalize same-sex activity between women. 11 countries still have the death penalty for homosexuality, and 15 countries criminalize trans people's gender expression or gender identity. I'm very proud of the fact that the promotion of LGBTQIA rights is a foreign policy priority for Ireland. Our missions abroad participate in Pride every year. We advocate together with our like-minded colleagues or the EU delegation for LGBTQI rights all across the world, including for the decriminalisation of homosexuality where that's in place, or campaign against criminalisation where that's being contemplated. Our ambassadors have signed letters around the world to promote LGBTQI equality. We joined the Equal Rights Coalition in 2019. In 2011, we co-sponsored a landmark UN human rights bill resolution on sexual orientation and gender identity. And we also work on LGBTQIA issues at an EU level as well. So Ireland, as well as our work abroad, we have a lot to be proud of at home, including being the first country in the world to legalise marriage equality by popular vote. We have one of the most progressive gender recognition legislations in the world. And in 2018, we also had the world's first national LGBTI plus youth strategy, which was a fantastic thing for Ireland to do. So in tonight's fireside chat, I'm going to take you through the progress of LGBTQIA rights in Ireland, as well as touching on like the US, where everything kind of kicked off, and then also Canada. So I will say, for just in case there's people that don't know, LGBTQIA is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and asexual, but I'm probably just going to use queer as shorthand because that is a lot of letters. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kathy. For anyone that doesn't know, Kathy is, she's the Executive Director of the Irish Canadian Immigration Centre. They're based in Toronto, but they've got an whole of Canada mandate. They're close friends and partners in the embassy. We're very proud to fund them through the department's Emigrant Support Programme, and honestly, we'd be lost without them. So I'll hand over to you now, Kathy. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone across Canada. It is a pleasure to be here tonight. The Immigration Centre is honoured and proud to participate in this event. And to Laura's point, we must still speak of it. I will highlight briefly that we had an incident of homophobia in our own Irish Canadian community last week on Facebook, and our wonderful community rallied to the support of the person in need. But we will keep speaking about this until it's no more. So thank you for joining us tonight. So I am going to be asking the questions this evening. And before I introduce you to Laura and tell you a bit about Laura's background and we dig into the discussion, I'll just give you a quick background on the Immigration Centre in case anybody out there watching tonight could avail of our services. So as Laura has pointed out, we are a national organization serving newly arrived Irish to Canada, all across Canada and from across the island of Ireland. And we can help you in three key areas: immigration, employment, and social services. So reach out. We'll make sure that you get our details by the end of this evening. And if you want to talk about any of those things or anything else, we're here for you. We have operations right across the country. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Laura and I'm going to tell you how tonight will work. So I will be looking down at my phone. I'm not ordering dinner, even though it's 7 o'clock in Ontario. It's not the pizza man. It's me checking the chat. So you are watching us on YouTube. If you are watching on your laptop, to the right-hand corner of your screen, there will be a place to pop your questions in the chat. And if you're watching on your phone, the chat box will appear right beneath the video. Have I got that right, Laura? Grant. Okay, so please do give us your questions. And at the end of Laura's discussion and back and forth with me, we will attend to some of your questions as time permits. So I'd like to tell you a bit about Laura because Laura is your keynote speaker tonight. I'm just here to moderate. So Laura holds an MSc in Equality Studies from the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice in University College Dublin, where her research focused on the Irish transgender rights movement. Over the past decade, Laura has contributed to the expansion of the LGBTQ+ activism landscape in Ireland at the policy and practice level with a range of contexts, including the university and NGO sector. She gives regular talks and workshops around Ireland about LGBTQ history, queer identities, coming out, and trans inclusiveness. Laura's first desk in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade was working on the departmental approach to gender equality and equality and diversity issues. And before that, she worked primarily in the voluntary sector. She was the National LGBT Rights Officer for the Union of Students in Ireland and is a former board member of Dublin LGBTQ Pride. Laura was the volunteer coordinator for the 4th European Transgender Rights Conference and sat on the board of directors of the Transgender Equality Network in Ireland for 5 years. So welcome, Laura. So I guess we will begin at the very beginning. Can you tell us about the early days of the LGBTQ+ movement? And I'm assuming we're going to be in North America.
I think for, the sort of Western world, this was where kind of everything kicked off. So I guess we should go all the way back to just after World War II. So kind of American society really wanted to go back to a sense of, normalcy where the husband was going off to work, the wife was back in the home, minding the kids, etc. So they, Senator Joseph McCarthy started his McCarthyism kind of, not a movement, but just that sort of outlook on everything, where, in their fight against communism, they were adding people to, lists, like so anarchists and everything else. And in the 1950s, they added homosexuality onto that list of un-American people as well, because homosexuals were deemed to be more susceptible to bribery and communism and God knows what else they were thinking at the time. But as part of kind of this, in the background, there were lots of anti-homosexual city ordinances were being brought in different places. So for example, one in New York, they dusted off an old anti-labor statute. So basically, people couldn't disguise themselves. So men had to wear X number of items of men's clothing and women had to wear a certain number of items of women's clothing. And, police, when they were raiding gay bars, etc., would check that your clothing matched the gender on your ID card. So it was a very hard time for the queer community and anyone that wasn't exactly gender non-conforming. So then in 1951, a gay rights organization called the Mattachine Society was set up in the US. So their whole thing was to prove to sort of American society at large that homosexuals were just like heterosexuals. So they imposed a dress code at their rallies and protests. So at their own events, women had to wear dresses, men had to wear suits, and they needed to prove to the straight people that the gays were exactly the same as they were, which isn't the most progressive way of doing things, but they thought that that's how they would convince American society to give them equal rights. So then I guess as things started to progress, probably everyone watching has heard of the Stonewall riots, and they were on the 28th of June in 1969, and it's the Stonewall riots that we commemorate at Pride every year, Pride in June, that is. I know in Canada it's on different dates, but most countries and places do it at the end of June, the last weekend of June, to commemorate Stonewall. But before that, in 1966, there was the Compton's Cafeteria riots, which is a lesser known part of the American LGBTQIA rights movement, where Compton's Cafeteria was in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. So it was a very popular place for kind of young LGBT people, particularly homeless people, and a lot of sex workers used to hang out there as well. And the owners at the time just kind of left into it. They'd come in, get one cup of coffee, sit there for the day, but it was just a place of safety. But then in 1966, owners changed and the new owners didn't like these people that were sitting in the cafe and not buying anything. Probably understandably, it's not a good business model, but they started to try and get rid of these kids. So they hired a security guard tried to kick people out. Someone threw a cup of coffee, someone flipped a table over, windows got broken, and suddenly it was a couple of weeks of riots. And the Comm's Cafeteria riots is the first recorded violence by gay people against the police anywhere in the world. So then 3 years later, in 1969, we had the Stonewall riots. So the Stonewall Inn was a very well-known gay bar in New York City. Like all gay bars in New York, it was run by the mafia because they didn't care who was drinking once they were, earning money. So they didn't mind that it was illegal to have kind of gay bars or whatever. So usually what would happen is the police would come to raid a bar, but they'd ring the bar first, tip them off, they'd be paid a bribe, grand, no one would come down, everything was fine. But this night, the 28th of June, 1969, no one knows why, but no phone call tip came through, so nobody was tipped off that the raid was coming. So the police turned up to the bar. They lined up all the patrons to check their clothing and check their gender, as they usually would. But this night, people refused to show their ID. The people that had been removed from the bar didn't move off for some reason. So outside the bar, people were congregating and staying there, and people started throwing pennies and then bottles and then bricks, and it went on into, I think, 2 full weeks of rioting, and because people were just absolutely sick of what was happening and the way their community was being treated and so on. So there's a narrative around Stonewall that it was kind of, your white gay men that kind of started it, but in fact it was trans women of color that threw the first bricks. And so your Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Riviera, like that gang of, they were known as drag queens at the time, but if it was today, they would have been, ID'd as kind of trans women. So then, after the riots kind of calmed down, the gay community really started moving forward and having like annual protests and pride marches and everything else to try and get their own, try and get their rights. But the beginning of the sort of separatism of the gay rights movement and trans rights movement started very early on, because in 1970, they had the Christopher Street Liberation Day, which was the first ever gay pride parade, but Sylvia Riviera wasn't allowed to speak, even though she was one of the women that kicked off the Stonewall riots because she was trans. So that was kind of happening from, I guess, the very early days of the LGBTQIA rights movement.
So so you've just talked about what ignited the spark in America, and I'm curious what the knock-on effect was in Canada, and were there similar events happening in the same time period here?
So interestingly, in Canada kind of had a very different trajectory. So in British North America, as it was then known, same-sex activity between men was actually punishable by death. But there seemed to be a reluctance to enforce the law, thankfully. So eventually they got rid of the capital punishment for homosexuality and replaced it with gross indecency laws in the 19th century, which kind of most countries had, like the Victorian kind of era laws on homosexuality. And then kind of in the 20th century, while those laws still existed, people weren't getting arrested as much, but gay men were being portrayed as kind of sex offenders in the media and sort of the popular discourse. But interestingly, in 1969, Canada decriminalized homosexuality, which was the same year that the Stonewall riots happened. So Canada had already decriminalized it by the time America was kind of kicking off their kind of rights movement. So I just think that's a very interesting comparison between the two countries.
Most definitely. And now, okay, you've talked a little bit about the intersections of various communities coming together. But has there always been a cohesive queer community? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, not really. So in the kind of early days, you had your gay men over here, your lesbians over here. Like there was no real trans community to speak of, and bisexuality was never really talked about. And in about 1981, when the first people started to get diagnosed with AIDS, or grade gay-related immunodeficiency, as it was known at the time, gay men started dying in their thousands, and nobody really cared because it was only affecting kind of gay men, people of color, and sex workers at the time. So there was no sort of large, like government help or whatever for them. So it ended up being then the lesbian community had to take care of their gay male friends, and that's when those two groups started to come together. And then after that, trans people started to get involved in the community as well, because trans people were getting more affected by HIV and AIDS than kind of other sections of the community. So then I suppose the formation of ACT UP really was a very important part of that as well. So ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So it was a protest and direct action group to kind of raise awareness of the amount of people that were dying of AIDS in the States at the time. So they'd hold like die-ins, some gay men that had died like donated their bodies to the cause, and they'd have funerals on the grounds of the White House and so on. Because even though, you know, it started in 1981, by 1987, over 36,000 people have been diagnosed with AIDS and over 20,000 people were dead. It was never mentioned until 1987 in kind of the White House. So that's, you know, where all those protests and that anger was coming from. And I think even like today, you know, if you look at the global reaction, like how quickly, and thankfully, how quickly everyone was able to react to COVID-19, bring in vaccinations, all this kind of stuff. But if you look at how long, and at the time, the very slow reaction to kind of HIV/AIDS, it's just a very big kind of comparison that you can see there. But yeah, I think that was probably the AIDS pandemic was around the time that the community started to come together into what it is today. So in the early 80s, I'd say.
And was that also happening in Ireland? Like we've talked about the sparks that ignited in the US, and then we've talked a little bit about parallels in Canada. Would you say that Ireland was having the same journey, or are we on completely different territory at this time?
I think totally different territory, because in 1969, it was still very illegal to be gay in Ireland, and homosexuality was still very, very much in the shadows, because at the time, you know, the sort of Catholic Church's sort of repressive and oppressive doctrine on homosexuality is what was ruling the roost in Ireland. So, you know, there was kind of complete silence on queer issues. Like people weren't talking about it, people weren't out. Like nobody would have, you know, everyone today kind of knows somebody that's gay or whatever. At the time, you know, no one had really talked about it other than that arty lad across the street that moved to America. You know, like they just wouldn't be very much talked about. And even with the silence on sexuality, there was a deafening silence on trans issues. But interestingly, there was a trans guy studying in Trinity College in 1945 who was transitioning on his summer holidays, but still like nobody was kind of talking about that. So yeah, I think it didn't really, when gay rights movements around the world kind of took their inspiration from what happened in the States, but Ireland was still kind of not ready for that yet, I guess.
And what would you say was the moment that brought homosexuality out of the shadows in Ireland? What was the turning point?
I think I've kind of done a lot of reading around this, and I think it seems to be a lot of people agree that the foundation of RTE, which is Radio Telefís Éireann, Ireland's national broadcaster in 1961, started to kind of bring, I think one of the quotes about it is that it brought sex and sexuality into the living rooms of Ireland. And one TD in particular in Ireland actually stood up in the Dáil and said that RTE was responsible for opening the floodgates to lust. So, which I've always heard that about RTE, you know. But yeah, there's one show called The Late Late Show, which is kind of a late night chat show that they, late night 9 p.m. chat show that they have in Ireland. And it was presented by a guy called Gay Byrne, and there will be a quiz on this later, so remember that name. So Gay Byrne presented The Late Late Show, and he was kind of very in favor of sort of the progression of queer rights in Ireland. So for example, on his show, he brought on a lady called Joni Crone, who was the first ever lesbian to be interviewed on Irish television. But then RTE got a barrage of complaints, one of them saying, "I do not pay my license fee to see that filthy person." So even though RTE were like, here are queer people, the people of Ireland did not want to see them at the time. Yeah.
So given that that was the landscape then in the early 70s in Ireland, like you've set that scene, you're young or maybe not young and queer in Ireland in the 70s. And where do you find your hope in terms of a queer movement?
So I think like in the 70s, things started to progress, I guess, quite rapidly just in terms of groups and stuff being set up. So in 1970, the Irish Women's Liberation Movement was started. And in the early days of the queer rights movement, the women's rights and queer rights were basically completely interconnected, so you couldn't really separate one out from the other. Then in 1974, you had the formation of the Sexual Liberation Movement, which, as far as I can recall, was founded by now Senator David Norris in Trinity College. Set in 1974 again, you also had the first Irish Conference on Homosexuality. And also in 1974, there was the first public gay rights demonstration. Now, only about 7 people turned up, but the point is that it happened. So they had their signs being like, homosexuals are revolting, which is really funny. So there was like 7 of them were kind of protesting outside the Department of Justice to try and get like rights or decriminalization or whatever. But I think, again, at the time, that didn't really go anywhere. And then in 1979, the National Gay Federation was founded. And they established a place called the Hirschfeld Center, which was, I guess, like a nightclub, but also somewhere people could come and gather. It was where a gay switchboard was located and all this. So a real like queer community center in Ireland, burned down in mysterious circumstances in the 80s, but it was there for kind of the early 80s and like the late 70s. And I think that was a real like focal point for the queer community in Ireland at the time. Well, for the lesbian and gay community in Ireland at the time. I'm using queer as a shorthand, but at the time it was just a gay and lesbian movement, just to be clear on that.
And what was, okay, well, first I'm curious about one thing before I go to the next question. Why was the women's movement intrinsically tied to the queer movement and vice versa? Or the gay and lesbian movement?
I think for a lot of the early feminist movements, there were a lot of lesbians involved in early feminism, but also as women were fighting for their own rights, you know, women were obviously an oppressed class. So they were also fighting for another oppressed class, in this case, like homosexuality. So I think that's why that was the same in kind of the UK and also a little bit in the States as well. Like a lot of your like women with the Y kind of festivals that were happening in the 80s and stuff were, you know, a lot of kind of queer women were involved with those. So I think it was just, you know, people in the community were also in the women's rights movement. And then also when you're fighting for, you know, I think like intersectionality basically would probably be the answer to that. Just fighting for other people's rights as well as your own, I hope.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was Ireland's Stonewall then? Was there a moment?
I think it would have been the Declan Flynn murder. So that happened in 1982. A 31-year-old Air Rienta worker called Declan Flynn was in Fairview Park, and he was set upon by a group of young people who had sort of a mission to rid the park of steamers, was what they used to say when they would go around kind of gay bashing guys in the park. I think they were aged, I think like 14, 15, 16 and 18, I think were the age of the guys that killed him. And they were all given suspended sentences because the judge in his ruling said this could never be seen as murder because they were basically performing a public service by stopping people cruising in the park. And then like after that, obviously there was massive public outrage in response to that. So there was a march to Fairview Park from Liberty Hall. And it was the Irish Women's Rights Movement and the Gay Rights Movement marched together for that. So the signs, I think I have a picture of them here, signs say things like stop violence against gays and women. So there was a definite sort of, you know, the two groups were very much together for that. And Canada actually had a similar thing here in 1985. A guy called Kenneth Zeller, who was a high school teacher, was murdered in Hyde Park in Toronto. And, you know, the youths that killed him did, in fact, end up going to jail. And after that happened, the Toronto District School Board brought in a program to like eliminate discrimination based on sexual orientation. So like, you know, one small positive came of that, but obviously, you know, it's not like it's terrible that that stuff happened in Ireland, but then also in Canada where you wouldn't really expect something like that to happen, especially when it had been decriminalized like in 1969 here, you know.
Bumpy pathway, indeed. So when was homosexuality actually decriminalized in Ireland?
Yeah, so it was kind of a long road for that in Ireland. So in 1970, when they founded the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, so the three kind of well, there was a few founding members, but the three main founding members were David Norris, who's now a senator, Mary Robinson, and Mary McAleese, who then both of them went on to be presidents of Ireland. So it was a pretty illustrious group that started this off. In 1983, David Norris took a case to the Irish High Court to challenge the constitutionality of the Victorian laws that governed male same-sex activity in Ireland. And he was unsuccessful. So in 1988, he then took his case to the EU Court of Human Rights, where he was successful. But then it took until 1993 for the government to put that legislation through to decriminalise it. But in 1993, then President Mary Robinson was able to sign the decriminalisation bill. So it's a nice kind of full circle moment that she started off, you know, with the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, and then 23 years later was the president that signed it into law.
No, I didn't know that. That is very, very interesting. Now, okay, so we've been talking about the homosexual movement in Ireland and the various advocacy being done by lesbians. What about transgender rights in Ireland? I mean, what was the journey and where are we?
Yeah, so I suppose the trans rights in Ireland, in terms of like a cohesive movement, it came a little bit later than gay rights, I guess. So in 2005, a group of Irish trans women traveled to Vienna to go to the first Transgender Europe conference, or the TGEU conference. And when they were at that, they saw that like all these other countries had these trans rights groups that were working on getting like gender recognition, and even things like getting your passport changed, just different things like that. And so they were like, okay, maybe we could set up something in Ireland. So when they came back, the Transgender Equality Network was kind of founded out of them having gone to that conference. Now, I should say, pre 2005, there were support groups and stuff for trans people in Ireland, like phone lines and just places where people could go to talk to other trans people, but there wasn't like a rights group, which is kind of unfortunate. And the people that founded Tenny have said this to me themselves, that, you know, it is kind of sad that they weren't helping a lady called Dr. Lydia Foy with her case. So Dr. Lydia Foy is the woman that we can credit entirely for bringing in gender recognition in Ireland. So in 1993, Dr. Foy came out as a trans woman, and she went to the General Register in Ireland to get her birth cert updated with her name and gender. And she was refused that in 1997. So she began a court proceeding to basically say, I would like my birth cert updated to reflect her name and gender. She was unsuccessful in that first court case in 2002, and in 2007 she took new proceedings in the hopes that maybe something would have changed and that she would be successful the second time. So in 2007, the judge rejected the case on constitutional and administrative grounds, but he did uphold the arguments that were grounded in the EU Convention on Human Rights from 2003. So then after that, I think briefly the government was considering maybe trying to challenge that, but in the end, instead in 2010, they formed the Gender Recognition Advisory Committee, where they got trans people and their families to come in and talk to them about what they wanted from any kind of gender recognition legislation, like what the trans community needed or wanted in Ireland. So they met with like hundreds of people, but then unfortunately the draft heads of the bill that came out in 2013 kind of didn't really reflect what the trans community had asked for. So there was, in the original heads of bill, there was a provision that to transition, you would have had to go before like a medical board of people to diagnose you as being trans or whatever, just very kind of problematic, like pathologization of your trans identity. And then there was also the single requirement. So the single requirement would have said that if you were a trans person, you wanted to have your gender recognized, you couldn't be married. You'd have to be divorced, because if you were married, it would have brought in de facto same-sex marriage. So obviously, if you're a trans person that's coming out and your gender is recognized, then you're in a same-sex marriage, and Ireland didn't have that at the time. So they brought in the single requirement. But what that would have meant in practice was, if you were a trans woman who would come out as trans and say your wife was fine with it, your kids were fine with it, you wanted to keep your family together, but if you wanted to have your gender recognized, you would have had to get divorced, which takes 4 years in Ireland. You'd had to live apart for 4 years. Then you'd had to apply to get civilly partnered, which took 6 months to go through. And then when you were civilly partnered, you would have had 169 less rights than you would have had when you were married. So it wasn't really, the best thing that was happening at the time. But thankfully, they had, I think it was 2013, the Department of Social Protection made a joint Oireachtas committee to investigate the heads of that bill. And they published a revised scheme in 2014 that had changed kind of a lot of the stuff that people weren't happy with, bar, of course, the single requirement. But they were kind of banking on the fact that marriage equality would go through. So then the single requirement wouldn't really matter anymore. And thankfully, marriage equality did go through. So, it didn't kind of impede the bill. Basically, on the 15th of July 2015, gender recognition became law in Ireland. It's one of the most progressive gender recognition legislations in the world because it's entirely based on self-determination. So you don't have to be medically diagnosed or anything. You can just sign a declaration, say that you are trans, and live your best trans life. You can have your documents changed and everything else on the basis of that. And thankfully, after all of her fighting, Lydia Foy was the first person to get her gender recognition cert and her new birth cert. So I think that was brilliant, and she's kind of finally being recognized in the community in Ireland as well for like her heroic fight by herself throughout the 90s to have her gender recognized. So that's a name to remember for everyone, Dr. Lydia Foy.
The way that you've woven that story to talk about marriage equality and the complications around that is fascinating to me. And it does bring me to my next point. I mean, I'm Canadian born, and I was darn proud of Canada back in the early aughts when we legislated through our government for same-sex marriage. But Ireland, of course, so now what year was it? You'll tell us this, but became the first country in the world to legalize marriage equality by the popular vote. So unlike Canada, like they made us do it, and I'm glad they did. But you guys actually voted for it, which has totally different implications, obviously. So, like, walk us through that journey.
Yeah. So I think it's a long and complicated one. So I should say as well, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say for the next few minutes is a lot of my like personal opinions as well, just as like a queer person in Ireland kind of living through it. But I suppose we go all the way back to the beginning. So in 2003, two women in Ireland called Catherine Sapone and Anne-Louise Gilligan, who has since passed away, married in Vancouver. They went back to Ireland where they both lived I think they were together for 40 years, I think, something like that, before they got married. They wrote to the revenue commissioners in Ireland to apply for the tax benefits that any other married couple gets. And their application was refused because of the dictionary definition of marriage as being between a man and a woman, which led to one of the funniest campaigns I've ever been involved in, where we rewrote the marriage definition and put it into dictionaries and bookshops. I didn't do that as a student, it's fine. So yeah, like that was a very strange, I think, way to come back on that, because of course dictionary definitions can change. But in 2004, they decided to challenge this decision in court. They were ultimately unsuccessful with that court case because the judge, and I just want to read it here, the judge took the view that although the Constitution was a living document, she was persuaded by the state's argument that the definition of marriage has been constant. And what that basically meant was if marriage equality was to ever come in Ireland, we would have had to go to a referendum to change the Constitution. So at the time, a group called Marriage Equality was founded to assist with what became known as the Cal case, Catherine and Louise. The Cal case was what it was known as. And kind of arising out of that, I guess the government kind of recognized that there was a need to have some form of legal recognition for like gay couples in Ireland. So they brought in civil partnership in 2009. But civil partnership, as I mentioned when I was talking about trans things there, civil partnership had 169 less rights than marriage equality did in Ireland. So it was kind of seen by a lot of people in the queer community as like a half measure because it wasn't full marriage and didn't afford you, like the full rights and responsibilities that you would have if you were married. So then that's, I think when civil partnership came in, that's really, really when the marriage movement kicked off, because people kind of saw that they were being legally treated as second-class citizens. So I remember, at early days of what was called the March for Marriage, kind of like a mini pride every August, on a Sunday towards the end of August. It was a very quiet news day, so you were guaranteed to get front page coverage of every single newspaper in Ireland. This group called LGBT Noise, which was a grassroots campaigning organization, kind of got one gay person plus 10 of their friends to come and march. It was like 6,000-7,000 people per March for Marriage. It was fantastic. It was like a really good day out while also protesting for something. But the posters were brilliant. I remember one woman had a sign that said first class taxpayer, second class citizen. And that really kind of stuck with, I think, a lot of people. So sorry, I kind of jumped ahead of myself there. So so Marriage Equality was founded for the Catherine and Louise Gilligan case. So they kind of worked on consciousness raising and appealing to, I guess, Middle Ireland, and also lobbying government and stuff. So Marriage Equality did loads of things, but the two, I think, most effective things that they did, the first thing, they released a video on social media called Sinead's Hand. So it was in the form of like an advertisement, and it was a man ringing on the doorbell and talking to some man and saying like, hi, can I ask for Sinead's hand in marriage? And you're like, oh, that's his girlfriend's father, cool. And then the father says yes. And then he goes next door and rings on the doorbell and he's like, can I ask for Sinead's hand in marriage? And the whole video is him going all around Dublin, ringing people's doorbells, asking, can he marry his girlfriend? And then at the end of it, it's just like, how would you feel if you had to ask 4.6 million people's permission to get married? And it was perfect. Like, it was such a good way of just making the point of what kind of queer people were going to have to deal with if there was a referendum. And the second thing they did, and this was a campaign that I volunteered with, was that you're not out until you're out to your TD campaign. So people watching that aren't Irish, a TD is what we call an MP. So one Irish TD at some point had said, I don't really mind about marriage equality because I don't have any gay constituents. So basically, Marriage Equality started a campaign to basically be like, can everybody please go talk to your TD and say, hello, I am gay and I live in your constituency and I'm a possible vote and so on. So they were doing that. Then there was the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network. We're kind of working in the same sort of space, like working with government to try and change the minds at kind of a policy level. Then you had, on the other side of things, you got LGBT Noise that were organizing the March for Marriage that I just spoke about. So they were very much grassroots, get people out in the streets, protest, let people see who you are, come out wherever you are kind of thing, and just get out in the streets and show people this. So that worked really, really well at the beginning, because those are two really important prongs with any kind of campaign. But then when I suppose the movement really, really kicked off, they all merged together because everyone had to be singing off the same hymn sheet for like the actual marriage referendum campaign. So they formed a group called Yes Equality. So I'm sure lots of you have seen those Yes badges, Yes and Tall badges that everyone was wearing. So I suppose the key objectives for Yes Equality were raise awareness that, so firstly, campaigning for equal access to civil marriage for LGBTQ people, equal access to the rights and responsibilities afforded to married couples, to raise awareness amongst people that civil partnership is not civil marriage, civil partnership is not marriage, and to raise awareness that it was civil and not religious marriage that people were fighting for, because I think that was a kind of source of confusion people, and a lot of people maybe wouldn't be happy with the idea of gay people getting married in a church. But it was just kind of make the point that actually we don't want to get married in a church, we just want to get married in a registry office or maybe a nice castle down the country or something. So yeah, those are kind of like their main kind of goals. So in Ireland, a lot of campaigns, like elections, everything, it's all done by posters, right? So people just put up posters. So during election time, it's just people's faces on every lamppost, like 5 posters high, and no one really knows what's going on because there's so many of them. But so you had the posters actually were like very difficult to look at. So this is just my personal opinion. Like, personally speaking, I don't think that a majority should ever get the vote on the rights of a minority, because it just, you feel like you're on trial all the time. Like asking 4.6 million people's permission to get married is exhausting. It's really, really difficult, and you feel like you're kind of like, I have to be on my best behavior all the time. Like I have to be this like good gay and be like, I want my white picket fence and my 2.5 kids. And, it was a really difficult thing to live through. But on the flip side of it is, even though I personally wish it hadn't had to go to a referendum, they can't take it away from us now, right? It's in the Constitution. So if a really conservative government was to ever come in, the government can't be like, we're getting rid of marriage equality, because it's in the Constitution now. So like it's protected. And also, the day of the results, when 62% of people in Ireland voted yes, it was like people were literally dancing on the streets. We were all in Dublin Castle for like 11 hours. It was amazing. Like people were dancing on the streets. So like that is a wonderful memory that came out of marriage equality campaign and stuff. But the lead up to it was so upsetting. Like I found a Facebook status in those memories thing from like 3 days ago. And it was literally like, no posters just made me cry on the bus, but at least lots of people are wearing yes badges. Because the posters, as I said, you had your lovely vote yes equality on the one side, and on the other side, the no campaign went kind of quite negative on what they were saying. So their posters were things like 2 men can never replace a mother's love, mothers and fathers matter, vote no, sure they already have civil partnership, etc., etc. So that was just really difficult as a queer person to kind of live through that. And I was like in my mid-20s, so I can't imagine what it would have been like for like a teenager kind of growing up and seeing this everywhere. But there's lots of great things that happened as well. Like you had there was leaflets. We're all mad for a good leaflet in Ireland, so you'd be giving out your leaflets like in your hometown, and people would be taking them and be really interested in everything, and that was great. But Gay Byrne, who we mentioned earlier, I told you to be a test. The guy that presented the Late Late Show lent his face to the marriage equality campaign, so they made like Gay Byrne leaflets. So it was Gay Byrne's face, and it was like, vote yes equality, here's everything about marriage equality, etc. Because grannies love Gay Byrne, right? So everyone was going down to visit their grannies being like, here's a leaflet I brought you. So I went over to my granny's house with the Gay Byrne leaflet, and I was like, here's a leaflet, granny, have a read of that. And like I was like, come here, I don't know how you feel about this, but would you consider like voting yes for me? And she's like, of course. And that was a story that so many people had. Like everybody's grandmothers were just grandmothers, like all they wanted to do is make their grandkids happy. So I think what I found a lot is in the run up to the campaign, a lot of people had written off elderly people, and they'd written off working class areas, like, oh, these people are going to vote no. But the thing is, elderly people have lived their lives, do you know what I mean? Like, they're very open-minded. I think people don't appreciate that enough sometimes, but like, you know, when I was giving out leaflets and stuff, all the sort of elderly people were like, yes, absolutely going to vote yes. And I found that it was a lot of sort of like middle-aged people, sorry, that like weren't as interested in kind of listening to what you had to say. And even like there were ballot boxes in inner city Dublin that were like 90% yes, which, you know, was fantastic to see. But I think a lot of people had written off those areas, just assumed they would be conservative, but actually no way, like they were the most kind of open group of people to talk to. So I think a great thing to come out of marriage equality is that it like subverted a lot of people's expectations. But in, I suppose, the run up to marriage equality, on the yes side, it was kind of very positive. There were like giant murals being painted. I've just pulled up some of the posters here. So like, you know, vote yes because marriage matters. You had your yes badges and everything. And then there was little things that started happening in the week kind of coming up to marriage equality. There was a journalist called Ursula O'Halloran. She's quite famous, like TV kind of presenter, journalist person. She wrote an article at the age of 54 in the Irish Times where she came out, and she'd never told anyone before that she was gay. And one of the quotes that has always stuck with me: for me, there was no first kiss, no engagement party, no wedding. And until a short time ago, no hope of any of these things. Now, at the age of 54, in a hopefully different Ireland, I wish I had broken out of my prison cell a long time ago. I feel a sense of loss and sadness for precious time spent wasted in fear and isolation. And I think there's not many people that could read that and be like, okay, yes, we're still going to vote no. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so celebrities like that. Daniel O'Donnell, very famous singer, beloved by grandmothers all over Ireland, came out in favour of a yes vote. Loads of celebrities were. Snow Patrol, that band, said that the yes campaign could use the song Just Say Yes in like all of their kind of campaigning coming up to it. And then someone started a hashtag home to vote, right? Which was, so under Irish law, you can't vote in elections. Like, we don't have postal votes or whatever. Once you step off the island of Ireland, you cannot vote anymore, but you have the right to vote for up to 2 years after you leave, as far as I understand it. So I have friends that like spent a month's wages flying home from Australia or from Thailand or wherever it was to vote yes, but this hashtag home to vote like really, really took off. So I had friends texting me from like Gatwick Airport, every single person in the queue wearing yes badges, all flying back to Ireland. Queues to get into Ireland, like in the immigration, were like all the way back to the planes. There were so many people coming home. And one Irish comedian said that, what did he say? The home to vote is like when you're watching The Hobbit and an army of elves you've forgotten from earlier in the film comes over the hill to save the day. So like there was just little moments like that that just were absolutely incredible. And same with the kind of results day in Dublin Castle. Like I said, it was called, I woke up in the morning, I went on to Twitter, I saw that ballot box I was just talking about from inner city Dublin's like 90% yes. And I was like, oh my God, like, is this happening? Like, is this going to be a yes? Got up, got dressed, got on a bus, went into Dublin city centre to go into Dublin Castle where all my friends were. And by the time I got off the bus, the no side had conceded, and that was at 11 o'clock in the morning. But in Ireland, we don't have electronic voting. It's all like hand counting. So we still were there until 7:30 that night waiting for the official results. And when the official result came out, like I said, there was people dancing in the streets. It was the most incredible feeling. But yeah, like I have very mixed feelings on it. Like that was amazing. Winning was amazing. But living through it, not so much. So when Australia went to a poll, was it 2017? They kind of asked like Irish LGBT activists, like, do you think it's a good idea for a vote? And we were like, no. Like, it's very difficult. And I think Switzerland is going to do a vote soon as well. So like it's hard for queer people to kind of go through it. But at the end, it's brilliant when people say yes, you know, because you're like, okay, I am a full citizen, and you know, everyone says this is okay now. And it was amazing because, you know, Ireland is obviously a very welcoming place, but you wouldn't pre-marriage equality, and this is just my personal thing again, you wouldn't have seen too many people holding hands in the street, but for weeks after the yes vote, everywhere you went, which is queer couples holding hands on the street. And there was just this like sense of everyone says this is okay now, you know, and it was really, really nice. Sorry, I've been rambling for way too long.
No, you have not at all. You have painted that so vividly. And I think it's really important for all of us to hear the personal perspective and not just the political. And it's no, that was beautifully said and shared. And you know, before we open it up to questions, if we have any, I haven't really checked. like, where would you say we are today in terms of LGBTQ people in Ireland and in Canada? And then I'll also roll into the next question, which is like, what are the next steps globally, in your humble opinion? That's a big question.
Yeah, so I think for Canada, I mean, like when I was growing up, pre-marriage equality, I was like, I'm going to emigrate to Canada because I can get married there and everything's going to be great. Because in Ireland at the time, it felt, like when I was like finishing college, like 2009 or whatever, it just felt like a pretty, it was like I said, they brought in civil partnership, and I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to have kids or get married or anything else in Ireland. And Canada's had all that since 2004, since before it was cool. So that's where I should move to. And ironically, ended up coming my first posting here. But I think, yeah, Canada, as I said, has had marriage equality since before it was cool. It was legalized in 8 of the 10 provinces and 1 of 3 territories since 2003, I think it was. And then in 2005, it became the first country outside Europe and the 4th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide after the enactment of the Civil Marriage Act. So adoption is legal in all provinces and territories here under varying rules. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity in employment, housing, public and private accommodations is banned nationwide. And transgender people are allowed to change their legal gender in all provinces and territories, but again, under kind of varying rules. So Canada's in like a really good situation as well. I think kind of similar to the situation that Ireland is in. So yeah, I think, there's obviously more to be done. I think in Ireland, the next big thing is probably kind of transgender healthcare, because at the minute there's only, I think it's 1 or 2 doctors trying to service the sort of the whole trans community in Ireland. And there's just very, very long waiting lists and things. And unfortunately, a lot of people are having to go abroad to seek treatment. So I think that's something that we're probably going to have to look into at some point. And then kind of globally, I think I kind of touched on it at the beginning, there's still a lot of countries where it's illegal to be queer. And I mean, like we've even seen in some parts of Europe, cities are declaring themselves LGBT free zones, and that's happening in like 2021. So, we've a lot of work still to do. So whenever I hear people say like, oh, why do we need pride or whatever, this is why we need pride. Like, just because it's good for us in our countries, it's not the same for people everywhere. Like an Iranian gay man got murdered last week by his brother just for being gay. So, there's a lot that still needs to be done kind of globally. And that's what's so great about like kind of Ireland's foreign policy being so progressive on sort of LGBTQIA issues. But that's kind of, yeah, like my personal opinion is like, that's what I think is the next big thing, just kind of supporting people in countries where it's not legal or not as accepted. And then in Ireland specifically, I think maybe trans healthcare would be a good next step for us.
I'm glad you brought up a story from Iran, because that's gotten some exposure here in the chat. Someone was asking about that, so I think it's important that we mention that. This might be a good moment, Laura, to note that this isn't the first time you and I have been brought together for a chat. So folks, for those watching, we did a podcast. The Immigration Center has a podcast channel, and Laura and I did a podcast on the experience of being queer and arriving to Canada. And I think it's very, very useful for all of us to watch, because we do see Canada as this beacon of hope and this really queer positive place. And it is, and you are very welcome here. And we make mistakes, and we don't always get it right here either. And I think it's important to talk about those mistakes. And so that's what Laura does in her piece about coming to Canada and coming to Ottawa. So it's worth a listen. Again, the personal perspective is so powerful, and we appreciate, Laura, that you've shared that. There's lots of comments and not lots of questions. Great, interesting comments that I could probably go on and read. People are very interested in some of the facts that you've shared, and people remember some of the ads that you're speaking to, but not a lot of questions. So let me see just this one here. Does Ireland have the option for an X gender marker or something other than the binary?
Sorry, I should have said that actually when talking about. Great question. It's a very good question. So trans healthcare, but also non-binary recognition is needed in Ireland right now. And right now, we only have sort of male and female, because for, I think, questions around like passports and things. So right now, as far as I know, there's only 2 countries in the world that have an X marker on the passport, and it's Canada, and then it's either Australia or New Zealand, or maybe both. So it's kind of, internationally speaking, the whole kind of passport issue hasn't really been addressed in terms of gender markers, and because of that, obviously, that's always going to come into play then when you're thinking about, can you get an X marker on a driving license or a birth certificate or whatever. So right now, unfortunately, the gender recognition legislation only covers binary trans identities. But yes, the person that asked the question, you're absolutely right. That is a question that will need to be looked at some point. Thank you for reminding me about that. I should have said it.
Well, it's good that we're seeing some dialogue here. How can religious families raised to believe that it is a sin to support their LGBTQIA members? Like how I guess the question is, how would you address that?
I think sort of issues of religion are very difficult because people have their like deep-seated beliefs, you know what I mean? And a lot of the time, you're not really going to be able to kind of change that. The tack that I always take when I encounter Bible-related homophobia is I have a very deep knowledge of the book of Leviticus, which is what people always kind of quote, no man shall lie with another man, whatever, even though that's been proven to be wildly misinterpreted. But however, that's what people go back to a lot. But like then, you can just turn around and give them the whole West Wing speech of, okay, well, my brother works on Sundays, which is the Sabbath. Can I, have him executed on the village square? Someone else is wearing clothes of mixed fiber. According to the Bible, we can have them burned at the stake, so on and so on. Like, you're not supposed to eat shellfish. You're not supposed to get tattoos, all this kind of thing. So I think people pick and choose parts of the Bible that they want, but I think the way to address it, or the tack that I would always take, is, aside from pointing out that you can't just pick out the bits you want, is that Jesus never mentioned gay people. So if you look at the New Testament, love thy neighbor, that's what he said. And like, kind of, that's how I would like generally address it. But I would say, like, in terms of, we're talking about like safety and kids wanting to come out to their parents and stuff, like, this is, something that comes up. I do a lot of coming out workshops in Ireland, and something that comes up time and time again. And I guess you kind of have to think about what you're safe with, or what is, if you're 17, for example, you realize that you're gay, your parents aren't going to accept you, but you're going to be moving out in a year anyway to go to college. Is it worth maybe waiting? I know it's not a good solution, obviously, but you have to be safe. You have to take care of yourself. So, I'd say that, like, if you're worried about how your parents would react, don't tell them in your house, tell them in a public place where you can leave if needs be, and so on. But I think for the religion thing, it's not a question that can be solved pretty easily, because church leaders themselves don't really want to address it. One thing that I found very interesting, actually, after the marriage equality referendum in Ireland, because, churches were kind of very much campaigning against it, like, the amount of stories, like, my mother was at someone's funeral in the lead up to marriage equality, and the priest used the eulogy instead of speaking about the dead person to talk about why everyone should be voting no. So half the congregation got up and left the church, like, that was kind of happening. But after marriage equality, the Archbishop of Dublin basically made a statement in the newspaper saying that this has shown how out of touch the church is with the Irish people, and that they might need to, like, reassess how they feel about different things. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's kind of a threefold thing. Like, you can always beat people with your Bible knowledge. You just have to be safe with whatever. If it is about coming out, you have to be safe, take care of yourself, and just, like, just kind of make sure that you are protecting yourself. And then, it's not really something that is easy to solve, because, people's religion is often like the most closely held part of them. So you can't really, it's a hard thing to challenge people on, basically. But at the end of the day, people tend to come around eventually. You are their child, and, like, people love you. Like, I was really nervous when I was coming out to, like, I was really nervous to tell my grandmothers, and one of them was like, isn't that lovely? Sure, aren't the nicest people in the world gay? Look at that Derek Mooney fella off winning streak. So people can surprise you also. You might think that, oh, this person goes to mass like 7 times a week, they're not going to accept me, but then they might. But yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't know the answer, but those are my thoughts on it anyway.
I think that's a very compassionate, tactical answer. So brilliant. More questions. Is the regression in trans health rights in England and Wales having any repercussions in Ireland?
Not yet, thankfully, but it is a conversation that is happening, which is very scary, obviously. Like, yeah, like, the the trans exclusionary thing, people keep trying to bring it into Ireland, and Irish people keep being like, no, we're not having it, which has been great to see over the last while. But with the healthcare thing, thankfully, kids are still able to, well, I mean, after their 5 years in the waiting list, are able to like access their like blockers and so on. But it's hard to tell. There's a lot of the sort of trans exclusionary feminist thing. Those voices are starting to come in just on like kind of Irish social media and stuff. And I know that recently, I think it was the HSC, somebody released some guidance talking about pregnant people instead of pregnant women, and that caused a big outcry amongst like certain sections of society, even though trans people can get pregnant. So women are people. I don't understand why the word people erases women, but anyway, that's kind of an ongoing conversation. Thankfully, there hasn't been any repercussions in Ireland as a result of the Ciara Bell case, but that's not to say that there won't be in the future. But fingers crossed, for now, it seems to be okay.
That, again, some great more comments, supportive comments about tonight's chat, about the various points in history covered. It's actually well timed because Laura at 7:55. So to be honest, I think we might be at time if we don't have one more question to wrap it up. Any final words to us tonight?
I don't think so. Just like, I suppose, thanks a million for coming, and just on like Idahotb, Idahotb, depending on what country you're from. Just I suppose it's a good reminder for all of us that just because we're in like Ireland or Canada or the US or whatever it is, that the fight for queer equality is not over yet. And to just to go back to a conversation me and Kathy had earlier, when you see people being homophobic or transphobic or biphobic or intersexist or whatever it is, call it out. Like, don't let those comments go by. It's important that you stand up for your friends or for other sections of the community. Just because it's not affecting you doesn't mean it's not affecting someone that you're friends with or someone that you love, or it's not affecting someone in a complete stranger in another country. I just think we have a responsibility when we're in a position of relative privilege and safety to kind of help people who aren't in as lucky a position. So I guess that would be what I would leave everyone with. And also just say thank you so much, Kathy, for moderating this. It's been brilliant.
I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody for watching. And Laura, that was illuminating.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.